Hello, friends, and welcome to our second lecture on American bureaucracy. Along with this lecture, there are, desire to learn, several important hyperlinks and documents for you to look at. One of those is a survey of all American bureaucratic institutions. So that's called federal government agencies. It's a hyperlink uh, collection that allows you to look at many agencies. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Also, there are some supplemental notes for bureaucracy that you will find to be very helpful, that you should study and pay careful attention to. And then on a more humorous note, there's something called the bureaucracy cabinet level descriptions, and that's a musical and I would just reiterate, mildly humorous introduction to the 15 major departments, where the majority of people who work for the federal bureaucracy work. Okay, let's turn to Bureaucracy, Lecture 2. You will find in this PowerPoint a outline as well as a listing of some key terms, and I would urge you to pay some attention to that as well. Okay, we're going to have a lecture in 4 parts. First part is going to deal with the unique nature of American bureaucracy. Second part is going to deal with the growth of bureaucracy, which was dramatic in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, but really for the last 40 years has been fairly stable. Thirdly, we're going to look at federal bureaucracy today. And then fourthly, we're going to look at some competing theories of how the bureaucracy can be the most efficient. Okay, let's start with part 1, the unique nature of American democracy. As we've discussed already in this class, in a parliamentary system, you have a prime minister, an executive who has a majority of the legislature on his or her side. Therefore, they can have tremendous control over the bureaucracy, over those who administer the government. So it's very important to keep that in mind when we turn to the American democracy and American bureaucracy, where we have divided authority. If we were to draw a triangle of the nature of American government, we would have the presidency, perhaps Congress, and perhaps the Supreme Court. Well, the bureaucracy is situated in between the president and Congress and must report to both the president and the Congress. Therefore, bureaucracy really has 2 bosses, which is somewhat unique in world politics, as American bureaucracy has to report to both the president, who has the power of the sword, the power to execute the decision of government, and on the other hand, must also report to Congress, who has the power of the purse, the power to pay their salaries, to pay for the programs that bureaucracy wants to carry out. So that's a very important consideration. When we encounter the bureaucracy in American politics, it's usually rather invisible. In fact, the terms, as we mentioned in Lecture 1, that we associate with bureaucracy, like red tape, faithless bureaucrat, are by nature negative. It's because bureaucracy is basically not something that we think about every day, or not something that we read about in the newspaper every day, or on the internet, or in the blogosphere. The bureaucracy is not as visible, even though it is very important. It can have a dramatic influence on our lives. Unlike the presidency or Congress, that we hear a great deal about, we can identify with specific people and who usually have a long background in American politics. Bureaucracy is quite different. It's more invisible. But bureaucracy plays a key role in your life and in mine, in almost everything that we do. Also keep in mind that when there's a lot of polling, most people are against bureaucracy, against increasing the size of bureaucracy. Even contemporary presidents have all run for office and then, when in office, criticized the role of bureaucracy, and as well as the desire to improve bureaucracy. Some good examples of that would be President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush 41, Clinton, President Bush 43, President Obama, and most contemporary American presidents have tried to reform bureaucracy and have themselves run their campaigns and their ideas in the direction of being critical of bureaucracy, even though the success of their administrations are often dependent on being able to guide and benefit from the work of bureaucracy. Okay, bureaucracy is also, in one of the unique aspects of American political life, guided by what we call complexes. That means that there are interwoven groups within bureaucracy that allow it to make decisions, also can challenge its decision making. A good example of this is, let's say, one of the secretaries of the 15 cabinet level departments. That person is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but then they may supervise as a political appointee as the secretary of a department, whether it be defense or health and human services, tens of thousands of employees. So they're part of the chain of command of the president, but then they must oversee a sea of career public servants who are there to administer that department. So they've got to work in two worlds. There are also groups within certain departments that tend to have more influence than others. And that's what we mean by complexes. It is a very vast and difficult organism to understand, but the better understanding we have, the better off we are as citizens, and the better we often are as citizens of being both critics and students of bureaucracy. Okay, let's look at our second topic on our outline, the growth of American bureaucracy. Please keep in mind that bureaucracy is a feature of all modern societies. In fact, our bureaucracy per capita, if you're to analyze it that way, is not as large as it is in many other countries. Typically, the largest bureaucracy within Western democracies is in Austria, where the government controls many businesses and therefore they're administered by the bureaucracy. That's typically an example. And just to reiterate, American political authority over bureaucracy is divided between Congress and the president. So these two bosses both have contributed to the growth of bureaucracy in American politics. There are many other factors as well. Please keep in mind that when we talk about American bureaucracy, we also have the issue of American federalism. Bureaucracy is at the federal level where we're spending most of our time, okay? But it is also at the state level and at the local level. In fact, most people who work for government work at the local or the state level, not at the federal level. There's simply more opportunities at the state and local level than they are at the federal level. That's just the reality. Also, on a related note, when people often talk about corruption in government, and there are many examples. In fact, it'd be worth to take a moment right now and ponder examples of corruption that you might know. Most of the corruption is not at the federal level, although that does happen occasionally. It's usually at the state, but even more likely to be at the local level. And it's the state and local level, after all, where there are the most employees. And they're in the front lines on many issues and closer to the possibility of corruption as well. Okay, first department, the first bureaucratic element was created in 1789. James Madison introduced a bill to create the Department of State. But if you look at the original Constitution, the Constitution of 1789, there is no required provision for cabinet level departments. They have all been created either as a response to national needs or as a response to encourage, support, or appease certain national constituencies. And you can look at the departments themselves and see some signs of that. Keep in mind that early on in the 18th and 19th centuries, all political appointees were based on their support, their friendship, or their political assistance that they had rendered to the president or some other office holder. We call that system patronage. That was the predominant system. And that was a system based upon really the ideas we talked about earlier. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, metaphorically. You support my campaign, you contribute to my campaign, you spend a long time campaigning for me, I may appoint you as president to a position in the American bureaucracy. So for all the 18th century and most of the 19th century, was a system based on patronage. Think about the advantages of the patronage system. Employees loyal, supportive, likely to follow the president's agenda to a T, right? On the other hand, there's some disadvantages of patronage. Patronage may not give you the best qualified person for any particular position, given that it's based on favoritism, not necessarily ability. And these are some topics for you to consider. But patronage was the predominant system. And there's a downside to patronage, however. People who were seeking office and did not obtain that office would become very upset. In the case in 1881, we had the assassination of a president. And in response to that, Congress and really the American people became very upset and thought correctly that bureaucracy needed to be revised. So Congress passed and the president signed into law something called the Pendleton Act that creates a merit-based system. A merit-based system. So that you would typically take an examination to judge your ability and your knowledge, and that would be the basis for your hiring. Even today, in the 21st century, we have a merit-based system. And that change in 1883 with the Pendleton Act created a new system of government, a new system of hiring for American government, American bureaucracy. Okay, in the early republic, in terms of actual numbers of employees, there were very few hired bureaucrats. This will change dramatically between 1816 and 1861. The number of federal employees, federal bureaucrats, increased about eightfold. One of the great watershed events, however, was the Civil War. With the nationalization of resources, the war effort, the federal government increased dramatically. Between 1861 and 1901, the size of the federal bureaucracy grew to about 200,000 people. Where we originally had 4 cabinet-level departments we call the inner cabinet because they were created really under President Washington. The Department of War, now called the Department of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Department of State, which would oversee and continues to oversee our relations with other countries. The Department of Treasury that oversees the minting of currency. From time to time, a national bank, and many other aspects of financial exchange, as well as an attorney general, the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, the chief legal figure. But in the 21st century, we have 15 cabinet departments, so you can see some idea of that growth. And outside the Civil War, another key event that allowed for the rapid growth of bureaucracy was the 16th Amendment. Now, as you remember, the 16th Amendment created the income tax, and it was voted in, ratified in 1913, comes in effect 1914. And that gives more money, more resources to the national government than it ever had before. That is followed by the national response to the economic depression of the 1929 and 1930s, and the response of Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, often described as the New Deal. Government was expected to take a more active role in the lives of the citizens, and indeed government did. this new tax collection increased the amount of money the federal government had at its disposal. So these events, Civil War, the 16th Amendment, the personal income tax, for the first time government can tax individuals directly, and the New Deal provided the basis for rapid growth of bureaucracy and rapid increase in the role of government in the lives of citizens. Okay. This brings us to our third topic, the federal bureaucracy today. No president wants to admit that he or potentially someday she has increased the size of bureaucracy, but inevitably many presidents have. We have about 2.8 million people who work for the federal government, plus over 1 million in the active and reserve components of the United States military. This is roughly the same as 1970, so we haven't had a dramatic increase in the last 40 to 45 years in the size of government. It's certainly less than we had during the Second World War, when we're in a worldwide catastrophic kind of enterprise. We've also tended to give bureaucracy more power. And one of those ways in which we've given bureaucracy more power is through what we call discretionary power. We've given bureaucracy the opportunity to make decisions on our behalf. Now, what we need to keep in mind as citizens is that we can reclaim some of that power that we have given bureaucracy. That's very important. And bureaucracy has taken power because we've allowed it to. Now, most citizens' involvement with bureaucracy is not direct, it's indirect. For example, most of us have no direct involvement with the Department of Agriculture, unless we're in farming or in manage a grocery store or where we have agricultural products. On the other hand, there's some agencies that have a very direct relationship. Most prominently, since 1914, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. They come after you. They follow up on you, individuals. They keep records on individuals. The FBI, and my hope and prayer is that you will never have any involvement with the FBI, but they have a direct involvement. The Postal Service. Most of us interact with the Postal Service on a regular basis. Sometimes the federal government gives money to local and state organizations based on this notion of federalism to carry out certain programs. One example of that is a social welfare net, where we often give money back as the federal government to state and local entities to carry out those programs. Transportation is another area. Along with this, in terms of the status of bureaucracy, keep in mind that we live in the 21st century in what one might call an adversarial culture. America and Americans prize individual rights and individual liberties. And so bureaucracy, as kind of the judge in some of these issues in terms of administration of government programs and funding, often runs opposed or in opposition to that adversarial culture. While many times we expect an expansion of personal rights, bureaucracy has to carry out programs that provide some restriction. For example, when a government regulatory agency, let's say like OSHA, O-S-H-A, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, makes a ruling, some group opposes that inevitably because it works against their interest, their ability. If it's a manufacturing or production plant or entity, it may work against their making a profit. Keep in mind also that the majority of people who work in bureaucracy, about 10 or 11%, work in D.C., the District of Columbia, the national capital. The rest of them work throughout the country. So most people think Washington is this giant cesspool of bureaucrats. That's not true. A vast minority of federal government employees actually work in Washington. Also, most of the federal employees, about 61%, work for the 15 major departments. And this is what we call the competitive service. These are people who take an exam. Only about 1% work are appointed by the president, but it is the most important 1%. It is the senior leadership, the political appointees, the secretaries, the head of agencies. And so this makes these are the very senior people in any administration. Okay, let's break down bureaucracy a little bit and talk about what are the elements. There are basically 4 elements of bureaucracy. in the United States. The first we've talked about at some length, and that's the 15 departments. Sometimes they're called executive departments. Defense and Human Services are the largest. Each one of these is a secretary, undersecretary, deputy undersecretaries, so they have between 10 and 15 senior leadership positions. But the secretary is the main person, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Okay? And if you look at the supplemental materials and desire to learn, you'll see these as well. The second type of bureaucratic entity is what we call the independent agency. That's usually a highly specialized agency that does not fit under one of the giant 15 departments, but has a function to serve. They are usually governed, overseen by an administrator who is a presidential appointee who must then be confirmed by the Senate. Some examples of these are NASA. NASA doesn't care about the vast array of programs that Health and Human Services has or the Department of Interior has. They're concerned about space travel and those very specific kind of interests. And so that's all NASA does, and that's all their sole function. National Science Foundation, for example, they fund scientific research in the United States, or at least government's contribution to scientific research. So what they do is try to find the best researchers, the best and most viable grants, and they don't worry about any of the other issues that the federal government becomes involved in. The third area is what we call independent regulatory commissions. And an independent regulatory commission is not overseen by an administrator or a secretary, but overseen by typically 7 to 10 people who serve a term longer than any one president, sometimes as many as 10 years, depending on the actual commission. So these commissioners then make the decision, make the recommendations, instead of a single individual or a group of individuals. And so they serve a limited term, even though their commission will have employees that are career civil servants. Okay. An example of this would be the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that oversees all nuclear power plants in the United States. This is a very, very important function, but this is all they do. And the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, same way. They're concerned about hiring practices in the United States. The last group, as you'll see from the supplemental materials, is what we call the quasi-governmental organizations. These are organizations that receive their approval of leadership from Congress, but they're basically allowed a great deal of freedom. The most famous example of this is the United States Postal Service, where its leadership is approved by Congress, but they're allowed to make a profit, which is highly unusual for a government entity, and the Postal Service can actually do that. And so that gives us a very quick overview of the 4 types of agencies. Okay, our final reflection is on how bureaucracy should be managed. There are basically 2 powerful critiques. The first and most famous is by Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, a great German sociologist. Weber argues that as society became more complex in the 19th and 20th centuries, and continues to become more complex, is that the need for greater specialization in government was a necessity. So bureaucracy is really based upon specialization. Every time there's a new idea, a new program, bureaucracy has to expand them to match those ideas. An alternative view is from the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, M-I-S-E-S, who argues that the real key to an effective bureaucracy is the efficiency of the organization. Bureaucracy must be based upon efficiency, cost savings, and therefore specialization that Weber endorsed will always result in more expenses and less efficiency. Therefore, von Mises says we have to trim the size of bureaucracy, keep it at a minimum, have large areas of shared power and accountability, and therefore cutting the growth of bureaucracy, making it more efficient is more important than specialization. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our second lecture on bureaucracy, a survey of these important issues. And invite you again to look at our documents and desire to learn. And thank you for your time and your attention.